Good evening. Thank you all for coming out to our second evening of Borders and Migrations events for our third version of Borders and Migrations. As many of you know, Canisius is celebrating our sesquicentennial, which is 150 years from our founding. And in honor of the fact that we were founded in a border city to serve different groups of immigrants, but German and Polish immigrants at that time. We are dedicating our Borders and Migrations Week to our history of service to our immigrant communities, both past and present. Mindful of the fact that we're one of only 2 Jesuit colleges on the border. Mindful of the fact that Buffalo's renaissance is in large part due to our continued spirit of welcome towards immigrants and migrants, of which Canisius is an active and proud partner in these endeavors. I want to thank all of the groups that helped make this week possible, including the Department of Modern Languages, International Relations, Sociology, the Bauhaus Library, the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs, Latin American Studies, the Office of Mission and Identity, Sigma Delta Pi Spanish Honor Society, the Institute for Global Engagement, the Institute for the Study of Human-Animal Relations, and Campus Ministry, which is reflective of something else unique about Canisius is our spirit of collaboration across multiple disciplines, agencies, offices, and peoples, which speaks, I think, to the character of Canisius as well. Regarding the library, I would encourage you to take a moment at some point in your days and weeks ahead to peruse things in the library. There's a display in the glass case as you take the stairs down about Vive, where many of that includes references to some of the people that stayed here at Canisius over the summer. There's a display near the anime books, I think, comic books, right, of the Kino Border Initiative experiences. There's photographs and reflections there. Speaking of which, if you are interested in participating in both domestic and international service immersion trips this coming year, our director of those programs through Campus Ministry, Caitlin Buhlman, is here. I want to say she's a graduate of our program, very proud of that. And there are forms in the back for that if you'd like to talk to her and or find out more information. The deadline is Friday. And also in the library is a display of books about borders and migrations, so there's lots of things to look at in the library as well. I also encourage you to check out the website for Borders and Migrations, and if you just Google Canisius Borders, it pops right up. There's all sorts of resources there, places that you can do volunteer work. There's a toolkit, and all sorts of information to enhance and enlighten your process of learning about migrants, migrations, and borders. And the videos from this week will also be posted there, so if you miss parts of some of these and want to rewatch them, they will be posted there too. After the talk, we are going to have a little fundraising sale if you're interested. We have these lovely bilingual graphic novels about borders and migrations, and we have these wonderful, fantastic, actually I'm wearing one right now, so. T-shirts for the Kino Border Initiative, which we are selling in an effort to raise funds both for Borders and Migrations as well as for Kino. So please talk to us afterwards if you're interested. And before we introduce our speaker, I'd like President Hurley to come up and give a few words about Joanna and his experience with the border, and to welcome you all here as well.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Reitzman. I want to congratulate you in getting this great week off the ground 2 years ago. Now we're celebrating our third. This I'll explain in a minute, but it arose out of your own trip to the Kino Border Initiative and what you could do to bring that experience back here to Canisius, which is important. In my own case. When I became president 9 years ago, I had an initial meeting with the people in campus ministry, and they said, well, what can we tell you about what we do? And we talked about all of what campus ministry at Canisius does. And they said, well, what do you think? And I said, well, I think I would like to go on one of your trips. And they said, what? And after I revived them with the smelling salts, they said, what? And I said, I'd like to go to El Salvador. And so I went to El Salvador, and Sarah Signorino was on that trip. She was the campus ministry lead for that. And so we went in 2011 to El Salvador. And that was a profound experience for me. I had not been to Central America. I had certainly read a lot about it, but I had not been to Central America to see it up close. That was followed by a subsequent trip that I ran for students and parents to Nicaragua to see the work of Agros International and their work in developing villages in Central America. Actually 2 trips to Nicaragua, and then I went back to El Salvador for the 25th anniversary of the Jesuit martyrs and their housekeeper and daughter in 14. And then it was followed up this past summer. I went again, and our team leader was Sana Gadley, who's with us. So Sana, great job on leading that group of students and adults through El Salvador and then on to the Kino border. And the reason I went this year is I always wanted to see. I'd been hearing about the Kino Border Initiative for a couple of years now. And more importantly, I had been reading the reflections written by our students who were there and came back and described in great detail and in very emotional terms what they experienced at the border. And I said, I really want to see this for myself. In his famous talk, now famous, I don't know, out at Santa Clara several years ago, the Superior General, Father Kolbenbach, talked about what Jesuit universities do best, which is giving students, an experience with the gritty reality of human life so that they can experience it and touch it and feel it and then deal with it. And that's what this is all about. So we arrived in Arizona and were met by our speaker tonight, Joanna Williams, who gave us a proper orientation to what we were going to see and what the dynamics were. And we had a fascinating couple of days. I think getting a balanced perspective on what's happening. And the conclusions that we drew were inescapable. That as I came back and as I explained in my convocation talk a few weeks ago, little did we know at the end of May when we were at the border that this whole issue of how we treat people at the border, not that it wasn't a big issue, but it was the issue of the year here in the United States. It has become the issue of the year. And we were right in the middle of it. And after we came back from Central America, it only got worse. And I pointed out and put the picture up there of the Salvadoran man who died in the Rio Grande trying to bring his daughter across. She was tucked under his shirt in the back, and they both died face down on the banks of the Rio Grande. A searing image on the front page of the New York Times, trying to demonstrate this is the extent to which people are going to try to escape what is going on in Central America. And I don't profess to have any great insight. I wish I had the magic wand and could describe the solution. Maybe Joanna will give it to us because she's talking about cultivating hope. But one thing I learned from Joanna in our sessions and from all the people at Kino was you need to look for where you can make some progress. So, if people we're deporting are running into trouble because you're confiscating their money and you're giving them a check at the end saying, here's your money back, but it's in the form of a check, which when they end up in Mexico, they can't cash. We should be able to solve that problem. Or the woman I met at the Commodore that afternoon, I was warned of this in things that I had read, that people who are recently deported will show up without shoelaces and without belts. And sure enough, I met a woman without shoelaces, and I had made the point of carrying some shoelaces in my pocket, and I gave her a set of shoelaces. And this woman was clearly defeated, having made an effort to cross the border, and then having been apprehended and sent back, she took the shoelaces and then like disappeared, and I looked and where's, and then I saw her a few minutes later, and these shoelaces were in her sneakers so that she could keep her shoes at her feet. So there were all sorts of little things where we could try to make the situation better. This cries out for massive change, and a massive change of mind and change of heart, but then change of laws and changes of approach. And what we realized in talking with Joanna and Father Pete and so many down there is we do what we can to keep this together as best we can while we look for where changes can be made, both incremental and then monumental. And so at the end, we were sitting at a table with Father Pete as he went through the challenge to all of us on our team. Okay, how are you going to take this back to Buffalo? You're not going to be at the border. You can't serve meals at the Commodore tomorrow. But how are you going to make this work in your community in Buffalo and keep it alive? And that's where Dr. Reitzman's idea for a consciousness raising and educational set of programs like this is part of his response as to how you do it. I've had my own. I've come back and I've written, I've talked. We made the decision here at Canisius to house the people from Vive. I found that to be part of the challenge that Father Pete laid down on that last day. So it was a profound experience. I would urge all of you to get out of your comfort zone. You can talk to Sana, you can talk to Morgan about it, you can talk to Caitlin, who was there. It was a phenomenal experience, and as I say, it's transformational when you encounter the gritty reality of life. So I'm grateful to Joanna for taking some time away from your very important work down at the border to be with us here in Buffalo, and to help educate and to inspire us to move forward. So you're a great inspiration to me, and thank you for being with us.
Well, I too am honored to be here and honored by the welcome that I've received here at Canisius. We have a phrase in the Jesuit campaign for hospitality, that hospitality reminds us that another world is possible. And that's some of the spirit that I've seen in the actions that Canisius has taken after returning from the many immersions to KBI. And it's some of the spirit that I want to invite you all into to reflect on this evening. So you can see here, the photo that I'm starting with is actually a photo of a mural that's on the entrance to our Aid Center. So when you walk into our Aid Center, it's a very, very, very small space. But the first thing that you can see in the wall across from the entrance is this mural of the Last Supper. Maybe a little bit different than it might be portrayed in many of our parishes, many of our churches. But the rest of the disciples are also there. So this is Jesus, obviously, but the rest of the disciples are also there with backpacks, with baseball caps, with the clothing that migrants are wearing. Because we truly believe that when we're seeing migrants, when we're welcoming them, we have the opportunity to welcome Christ. And we also truly believe that the Last Supper and the Eucharist is a beautiful sign and reality of community. And that if we're going to cultivate hope at the border, if we're going to fulfill this grand phrase that I put as my title, then we need to be able to do that in community. And so that's the journey I want to invite you along with for the rest of this evening, is to reflect on how do we as a community cultivate hope. And that means that we're going to have to go through a journey that confronts the despair that is very real and daily and present and persistent at the border. But it's not a despair of total darkness. So my encouragement would be, don't leave halfway through the talk. Don't leave in the time of desolation and despair. But stick with me in the spirit of community, and let's move towards that hope, and let's enact hope as we leave these doors. And we're able to do that from a really privileged position as the Kino Border Initiative. For those of you who aren't familiar with the organization, we work in 3 different dimensions. So we're a binational organization. We work in 3 ways. One is this direct assistance, humanitarian aid. We've served over 90,000 meals thus far this year. On Friday, we served 290 people breakfast in our very small, quarter of the size of this room, Aid Center. So it's just the basic, get somebody a shoelace, get somebody a plate of food, the medical attention that they need. But also, we work in 2 other dimensions. One is education. How are we transforming hearts and minds, not just in the United States, but also in Mexico? For example, next week, on next Tuesday, we're going to have a march where all the kids that are at the comedor are going to do a march in favor of climate change. There's a lot of pollution, a lot of disregard for the environment in the community in Nogales, Mexico. And so the children, many of whom have been displaced in some ways because of climate change, are going to take to the streets and carry their plastic bottles and show how that waste and how the use of plastic is affecting our environment in Nogales, Mexico. Education, obviously, is what also brought me here today at the invitation of Canisius. And the immersion programs that you hopefully will decide to participate in are part of that education, part of that transforming of hearts and minds. And then we also work in the area of advocacy, which means how are we going to change the policies and laws that generate this despair? How are we going to have policies and laws that promote hope in the community? And that requires engaging with congresspeople, it requires engaging with people in power, and it requires also looking at these very tiny incremental changes that President Hurley made reference to. So we have this larger vision, but we also have the incremental work of making our society, making our laws just slightly better, just slightly more humane, just slightly more just. And when we reflect on the motivation for that, and also the motivation for migration in terms of this concept of hope, in some ways, hope can be a very obvious manifestation here, very obviously manifest at the border. Sometimes it's folks like Roberto's the photo on the right. He arrived to the comedor and was very clearly outwardly manifesting hope, despite his circumstances. So when I started to ask him about his journey, he said, "I came with a backpack full of dreams and jugs full of hope." It's a literal quote, but he was a very poetic man. So he came with his backpack full of dreams and his jugs full of hope. He came with this illusion that if he could make it to the United States, he might be able to provide a better life, not so much for himself, but for his children. He had a son that was about to finish high school that really wanted to be a doctor, like maybe some of those of you in the room have thought about. And all that he wanted to do was make some money so that his son could study medicine and could have a better life, could have a better career than the manual labor that he'd been doing for years in Mexico. He also wanted his 13-year-old to be able to continue in high school, also with that dream of university that you all are enjoying in this space. And unfortunately, he didn't accomplish those dreams. He went out into the desert, tried to make it into the United States. He spent 4 days under the hot desert sun, wandering, abandoned by a smuggler, without food, without water. Those jugs that were full of hope weren't full of any kind of water that could help him survive in the desert. And ultimately, he was then detained by Border Patrol and deported back to Nogales. And yet there was that dream that was persistent in him. Even being in Nogales, even after his deportation, even after those dreams were shattered, he said, "Look at these hands." He held up his hands to me. He said, "Look at these hands. These are hands that are ready to work, Joanna." And he continued to have faith that he was going to find an outlet for that he was going to find a place where he could accomplish his children's dreams or help his children realize their dreams. So in some ways, he very outwardly manifests hope. But sometimes when folks are migrating, they're longing for safety, it's a little bit more complicated. Sometimes we have women like Candelaria. I'll call her Candelaria, it's not her real name, but she's from the state of Sinaloa in Mexico, which is just a state south of Sonora, which is a state that we're located in. And she and her 2 children had been facing many threats from organized crime, from the cartel in the area. You might have heard of the Sinaloa cartel, which was run by Chapo Guzman, who's now in prison. But they were being directly threatened by the cartel. One day the cartel even came and shot up near their house. They were almost in the middle of a gunfight. They went to the police and tried to report it. And the police said, "Well, you weren't harmed. You weren't injured in this, so we can't take the police report." And Candelaria and many other women in the comedor have said very frustratedly to me, "Are they just waiting for us to die to take the police report? What would it take for our police and for our government to actually protect us, instead of to say, we can't do anything, we're unable?" Instead of, as we saw this week, then deciding to release somebody who's in charge of the drug cartel instead of detain. And so Candelaria migrated less so because she had a dream of what life could be in the US, but more so out of desperation, out of this knowledge of I don't have other good options. So in many ways, migration is equal parts hope and desperation. And sometimes the desperation is even more manifest. A woman that I'll call Lidia, who's not pictured on this slide, arrived to our comedor on Friday. And I was doing intake, so we do an initial survey when folks come into the comedor. And I just asked her, what city in Mexico are you from? It was just a basic intake survey question for our survey. And she started crying and sobbing uncontrollably. And she said, I've never been loved my whole life. I've been abandoned by my family. I've never been in a place that people cared about me. I'm not a criminal. I've never been loved. And she just kept repeating this, I'm not a criminal, I've never been loved. And I said, well, you're here now, I'm listening to you now. What happened? She shared with me that she had grown up, she has epilepsy. She had grown up with epilepsy. Her family had believed that was a problem, an issue that she had that maybe was connected to some sin, maybe it was connected to something that she had done. They never cared for her, never wanted to support her. And instead she was grappling with this epilepsy. And she also had 2 kids. She has a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old. So not only does she have to pay the medicine for her to keep her condition under control, but also anytime that she tried to find work, if she had an epileptic attack at the work site, she would lose her job. And so she was in this constant environment of instability without anyone in the community that she could lean on. She had been ostracized in part because of her condition. And so she came to the United States, again, maybe not out of so much an American dream, but out of desperation, out of a sense of maybe there's somebody who will welcome me there. Maybe there's some way that I can get enough money to support myself and support my children. And instead, she's crossed with her group. She tried to get in through the desert. And when her group was apprehended, the Border Patrol agents who apprehended them started laughing and they started cheering. They started applauding her detention. And when she recounted this in particular, she started crying again. And she said, they just don't understand. They don't understand that I'm not here to harm them. They don't understand why I'm even here. But this, having been mocked by her family, having been ostracized by her community, and then being mocked by US law enforcement officials, was in many ways the last blow as her spirit was breaking. And so she, in this moment on Friday, and I don't know what she decided to do on Friday, I asked her what she wanted to do next, and she said, I don't know what I could do. I don't have the support of anyone. What I've tried to do has so far failed, and just is living into that desperation. And so she and Candelaria and Roberto, whether or not they left for a reason of a dream or of a hope, what they all encountered was a system that's designed to generate despair. This is a system that for 25 years has been designed to generate despair. 25 years ago was Operation Gatekeeper, which was one of the first manifestations of really intense border security. And the philosophy of Operation Gatekeeper and many subsequent efforts at border security was if we secure the urban areas, if we secure cities like Nogales, cities like El Paso, then it'll push people to migrate further out into the desert. It'll push people into increasingly remote areas of the desert where they're likely to die. And that fact, that pushing of migration out into deadly terrain, will stop people from coming. It's a policy called prevention through deterrence. And in some ways, the policy worked, because people did start migrating into more and more harsher, remote terrain. The number of people who had died increased. And in some ways, the policy didn't work, because the US government didn't recognize the strength of people's reasons to migrate. They didn't recognize that even though people knew they were risking death, even when people had suffered death, their neighbors and their family members and their community members continued to come. Just last year, I met a Nicaraguan man whose mom had died in the desert 10 years ago. The very same Arizona desert that he was intending to cross through. But he said, I don't have another option. I know my mom has died in this terrain. but I too need to move towards safety, just as she was trying. And unfortunately, this policy of prevention through deterrence, this policy of generating despair through death, is something that's particularly affected us at KBI this summer. In July, we know of 2 instances where folks who came through our comedor, people who received aid at our aid center, ended up then trying to cross and ended up dying in the desert. In one instance, one of the women, there was 2 women traveling together, and her traveling companion was then deported and came back to us and talked to us about her sense of desperation as she walked by the side of her traveling companion, her friend, and watched her slowly deteriorate until eventually she collapsed. And there was nothing that she could do to save her. You might say that it's the harsh desert sun. You might say that it's the dehydration that's causing these deaths. These are ultimately deaths by policy. That it's policy that's driving people out into the desert, into a situation where they're exposed to this death. And there's other manifestations of this policy of despair. So the prevention through deterrence has been in effect for 25 years. And for at least a decade, we've also had the policy of despair through detention. So when people enter the United States and they try to seek asylum or seek some kind of legal status in the US, in many cases they're not being released into the community to go through their immigration court hearings, with some exceptions. So for example, we can't at the moment detain children more than 21 days. But many other people, as some of you know, are held in immigration detention. One such man came to us in June of last year. So June 2018, he was fleeing violence from Guatemala. We oriented him to the process. He said, "I'm ready to face detention, knowing that I'll have my court hearings and I'll have to be in detention for a prolonged period." To this day, he's still in detention. Almost 18 months later, he's still in detention with very little end in sight. He's suffered medical neglect. He's had to have surgery because of that medical neglect. He's recovered from surgery while still in detention. He's gone through numerous court hearings, and yet he remains in this very facility that's in the picture. And detention in the law, so the legal statute, what it says is that detention is to prevent people from, who is to hold people administratively, so these are people who aren't charged with a crime. These are just people waiting for their immigration court hearing. They're meant to be held administratively if they're a flight risk or if they're a danger to society. That's what the statute says. But the reality of the policy of detention, this is consistent from our current administration and the previous administration. The reality of expansion of detention is that it's a policy that's meant to deter. It's a policy that's meant to generate despair and to stop people from thinking about migration. And countless government officials have spoken about it in those terms. So prevention through deterrence, generating despair through detention, those are long-dated policies we've been grappling with for years. And yet, in our current reality, we're faced by ever more policies directed at despair. One of them, which started in May of 2018, is officially called by the US government metering. We at Kino Border Initiative call it turnbacks, so we think it's a more literal, accurate word for what it is. But it used to be that when somebody was seeking asylum, when somebody like Candelaria or this young man from Guatemala walked up to the port of entry and said, "I'm afraid of going back to my country," the Customs and Border Protection at that moment would detain them, and at that moment would put them into the asylum process. Doesn't mean that they would qualify for asylum, doesn't mean that they would win their case, doesn't mean that it was all wrapped up quickly, but it at least means that somebody was able to quickly enter the process, that they weren't in limbo on the Mexican side of the border. In May of 2018, one day after the family separation policy was announced, if you remember, when family separation policy was announced, Attorney General Sessions, then Attorney General Sessions, said, "We're separating families who broke the law. We need everybody else to present at the ports of entry and follow the law." And the very next day, what they started to do at the ports of entry is to tell asylum seekers, "We don't have space for you. We don't have capacity. We're just too overwhelmed. You need to come back later. Wait your turn." And at first it was days that people were waiting, then it was weeks, and now it's months. Now people are waiting in Nogales for approximately 2.5 months. And I know many of you in this room don't necessarily have kids, but if you have any experience with younger siblings, the way that somebody described this policy to me is going to the airport with 2 small children on the worst day, when they're having the worst day possible, and then doing that every single day for 2.5 months. So imagine going to the airport with small children every day for 2.5 months. That's what it feels like to be in this limbo of turnbacks, to be in the limbo of remaining in Nogales, Mexico, just waiting to see if maybe today Customs and Border Protection will process a few more people. It means that children who already suffered violence in their own communities are now continuing in a limbo, in a very unstructured limbo. So some of these children are from the state of Guerrero, where schools have been shut down for months because the cartels have threatened the teachers, and so teachers stop showing up to class. And then they come to Nogales and they're out of school for another 2.5 months. They don't have an environment in which they can heal from what happened to them in the past, but instead they're in this chaotic space with 100 other kids. It means that as we move into the flu season, we're worried about what that will mean for the health of folks in our aid center. I followed up with one of the families after they'd already gotten into the US, and I asked them how it felt to be in Nogales, and they said, Joanna, it felt like I was sick every single day for 2.5 months. I know all of us have gone through seasonal illnesses, but being sick, going through the flu time and time again is a different reality. And it also means that particularly vulnerable populations, especially the LGBTQ community, are in particular risk, because they're not only fleeing violence from their own communities, but they're also targeted and harassed in a border city like Nogales, Mexico. Sometimes by organized crime, and sometimes by people just on the street who will assault them, will insult them, and attack them. And so it's created this limbo that we thought, when metering started in May 2018, you can look up the newspaper articles because I was interviewed many times, I kept saying, we think this is temporary. We believe Customs and Border Protection. It's probably just a capacity issue. We're gonna work this out. We were in dialogue with Customs and Border Protection. They said, we just had a really overwhelming week. I said, I understand, we're gonna move this line along. And it took me until I saw the stats for May, until I saw that they actually hadn't received more people than they had in previous months, that we started to realize that this was actually a systematic policy. That this was a policy that was designed to make migration more difficult, making seeking refuge more difficult, and in doing, to deter people, to create despair. And then the final, and I think in many ways most relevant policy that was added in January of this year is a policy that we call Remain in Mexico. So it used to be that people were able to seek go through their asylum cases and their immigration cases from within the United States. And now in most cities along the border, people are being returned to Mexico with a court date in the United States. This has affected a family from Honduras that we received in early September of this year. They had fled from threats by organized crime, by gangs in Honduras. There was a mom and dad and their young son. And they came up to the border in South Texas, near McAllen. They crossed the border, turned themselves into immigration authorities, and were held in a holding cell for 11 days. So a holding cell, just to give you a little bit of perspective, is probably 1/8 of the sizes of this room. So maybe this little area of chairs to about where Sarah is. And it's just concrete, no beds, no showers, very little access to phones, a little toilet in the corner that just has a half wall to protect it. So they were in this cold holding cell for 11 days. And then immigration authorities sent them back to Mexico and gave them a court date. Said, come late November, back for your first court date. That's just the first of many court dates in an asylum process. And they showed up in Matamoros, Mexico, and the dad had told his family to wait for him in the shelter. He was going to just go out and receive a money order. And as he was walking along the street, was assaulted and beat up by organized crime in Matamoros. And the family, fearing for their well-being, came to Nogales to try to seek safety here. He said, maybe if we turn ourselves into immigration authorities in Nogales, then they'll understand us. Then they'll understand the danger that we're in here in Mexico. While in Nogales, they were almost kidnapped. They fled their kidnappers and ran towards the port and arrived crying to Customs and Border Protection officials who said, you really shouldn't be crying, you're just making this up. And then they were put in a holding cell there for several days where they went through what's called a non-refoulement interview. So an interview that was supposed to evaluate their fear of return to Mexico, but we're finding that 1 out of about 500 people actually pass this interview. It's designed for people to fail, and they would then return to Mexico. And when I was talking to this mom and dad, and their little child was there with them, the dad actually started to get so anxious that his blood pressure skyrocketed. We were afraid he was going to have a heart attack. And the mom was crying, and she said, you know what's been the hardest for us is maybe not for us as the adults, but it's for my son. Because their son was on the autism spectrum. And their son now had been in limbo, not just fleeing from Honduras, but being in these different holding cells on different occasions, being with all of these other families, being in an unstable environment, and he wasn't able to cope with that because of the fact that he was autistic, because of the fact that all of those pieces of the environment were making it more difficult. And when we're faced by these policies of despair, whether it's death in the desert, whether it's detention, whether it's turnbacks, whether it's remain in Mexico, it's hard to know how to move forward when we're receiving folks who are in these tiers. And yet in some ways we see glimmers of what it means to defy despair. We see glimmers in the lives and in the decisions of the folks that we do receive. This is a photo actually of Guadalupe Garcia de Gallo. She was one of the first people removed under the Trump administration. She was a mom in Phoenix, and a community organizer. She was an activist there as well. And very soon after the new administration, she was deported to Nogales, Mexico. But I actually put up the photo not so much to share her story, but because her story reminded me so much of a woman that we also received on Friday. A woman whose name was Maria, who has lived for 15 years in California. She's a single mom, so she has 2 kids of the ages 11 and 10. And she made sure that she got a work shift where she could work in the morning so that she could be out in time to pick up her kids at school. Her kids had struggled a little bit when their dad abandoned them, but she got them into counseling, she had them in sports class. In fact, when she walked into the comedor, she looked around and she said, you know, I've been in one of these. And I thought, oh, have you come here before? She said, no, I would go and give food to the homeless in California. Every Saturday I served in a soup kitchen like this, except for I was the one in the kitchen and not the one sitting here and eating this meal. And she then, in May of this year, was detained by ICE agents in her house and was deported to Tijuana, Mexico. Very shortly after being deported, she turned around and tried to cross again. She said, I have to be back with my kids, I'm gonna make it back to Northern California. And again, she was detained, held for 5 days and deported. At this point, it was summer vacation. She brought her kids back to Mexico, went to her hometown to try to figure out what are my other options, and ultimately sent her kids back to be with friends in the US and tried to cross again, close to Nogales. In this most recent crossing, she injured her foot, and so she was actually in a cast as she was sitting in the comedor. And I asked her, well, what are you gonna do next? And she said, well, tomorrow I'm going to Agua Prieta to try to cross again. And I looked at her cast and I said, Maria, there's no way you're gonna cross the desert. So, okay, well, I'll recover until I can walk, but then I'm gonna cross the desert. I'm gonna get back with my kids because there's nothing that's gonna keep me away from my children. There's nothing that's gonna make my children feel the abandonment that they've already felt when their dad left them. And so in some ways, Maria was acting out of despair, but in some ways her very movement, her very decision to cross the border was an act of defiance. It was an act of saying, my love is stronger than this. And I don't know what that means, and I don't know what will result, but all that I can do as a mom is love my children well. And I used to think that situations like Maria's were the best that we had as hope. And well, maybe Maria's actions, Maria's decisions, maybe that's what hope means. But I've grown to learn that we can't put that much on one person, that we can't confuse persistence with hope. Because ultimately it's a persistence, again, that's equal parts despair and hope. And how are we gonna really present a vision of an alternative world? How are we gonna remind ourselves that another world is possible if all that it means is persistence in the midst of terrible circumstances? And so I'd argue tonight that there's other manifestations of hope that we can focus on. There's manifestations of hope like that in the life of Cynthia, a hope that's not built in isolation, but that's built in community. Cynthia was a woman who was from Oaxaca. She was actually a school teacher in Oaxaca, but because she didn't have any government connections, she couldn't get a good school teacher job. So you have to know somebody, you have to be friends with somebody in government to get assigned to the job. And she and her husband, Jose, were supporting aging parents, and they decided we need to go to the United States and make money to support our parents. So they tried to cross the border. They were deported. They tried to cross again. Cynthia was put in jail for a month for re-entry after deportation, which was a crime. And Jose was put in jail for 2 months. And so Cynthia arrived alone in our women's shelter, desperate, thinking, first of all, I was already in poverty, that's why I came to the US. But now I'm several $1,000s in debt because of the fees that I've paid to my smuggler. And now I'm without my husband, so what am I gonna do? And she, in some ways, was living in that aloneness and that despair that Lydia expressed to me. But in other ways, she was able to be surrounded by community in a special way in our women's shelter. So in the month when Jose was in jail, she started to make earrings and bracelets at the women's shelter. We have a cooperative where women can make earrings and bracelets, and first of all, it serves as some kind of occupational therapy of changing the message and saying, I can do this. I've been told in a long time that I'm not worth anything, but I can make this bracelet, and I can make those earrings. And I can focus on this instead of the cycles of doubt and of trauma. But it's also a form of economic support. It's also something that we sell that then the women get paid for each item that they make. And by the time that Jose was deported to Nogales after his jail sentence as well, Cynthia had started to find community in Nogales. She had started to realize that she wasn't alone in her journey, that she could count on the sisters that work for our organization, that she built friendships with other people. And she started to share with Jose, maybe we can make a life here. And now a couple of years later, Cynthia and Jose still live in Nogales. Not just out of their own perseverance, but out of the community of people that they've been able to find. Every time we have a celebration, a going away party, or a birthday party, Cynthia and Jose are there. Because they say, I feel like our family is Kino. I feel like we found family here in Nogales. And that's why they're part of the reason they've stayed. And that's why they're able to start paying off their debts. Because sometimes migration isn't the ultimate answer. Sometimes going to the United States isn't something that will really accomplish our dreams. Sometimes what we need is to build community in many spaces, which is a community of hope that Jose and Cynthia have been able to enjoy, but also contribute to. So Cynthia, as I mentioned, she's a teacher, and she comes once a week now to the women's shelter as a volunteer to do activities with the kids and to do activities with the women, because she identifies with them and can also transmit incredible joy, having ventured through her space of pain. And Jose Luis, who's pictured here, is another part of that journey of generating hope and community. Jose Luis had fled violence in the state of Mexico. He was threatened and targeted because his wife's brother was a judge that had convicted somebody in the cartel, and so they were going against the whole family, which included Jose Luis. So Jose Luis fled to Nogales, or to Arizona, tried to seek asylum, spent almost a year in detention, and then lost his asylum case and was deported to Nogales. He then tried to cross again, and he was put in jail for 30 days for illegal reentry. And then as he was in jail, he said, one of the joys that I discovered while I was in detention and while I was in jail is it gave me the opportunity to go back to my art. He said, many, many years ago, before I was a dad, before I had grown up, I really enjoyed painting and I enjoyed drawing. I had these long, unstructured days in detention and in jail when I started to draw again. And when he got to Nogales, he started to paint again. And he was able to do that in part because there were other artists at the time that arrived in the Comedor. We had another artist whose name was Wences, who was also a painter. And they would paint together, and they would collaborate, and they would share designs. And he felt welcome in our space. And he started to feel welcome in the city of Nogales. He felt welcomed by volunteers or by others who came through. And it gave him the opportunity to start to develop his art. And this spring, he's going to be putting up an art display at the Gallery of Nogales in the art museum in Nogales, Mexico. of his art, which in many ways is protest art. In many ways, he's depicting the Virgin Mary crying at the border. He's depicting Christ riding on the trains. But in many ways, it's an art that points to the hope of community, the hope of a space that he's been able to step into, where he's not defined primarily as being a migrant, but he's defined as somebody who's a friend, he's defined as somebody who can give advice, he's defined as somebody who's an artist. And that's the joy that Jose Luis has been able to create and also to bring to our space, to our organization, but more importantly to the community in Nogales. So where do we all fit into this? What does it mean here at Canisius? It's one thing to tell an inspirational story about Cynthia and Jose Luis, but what does that mean for us here? It means that we need to get to the right slide. So one suggestion or encouragement that I would give to you is if we're going to build hope in community, that means building hope in community that's able to do public and prophetic action. The ally of despair is invisibility and is silence. Part of why despair works is because people feel isolated and not listened to and feel silenced. And one of the ways that we can combat that is to very publicly stand with them. You may not know this, but you all were part of a Jesuit Day of Action on October 10th. So you can see on the right, actually, this is a public action that we did in Arizona at Senator McSally's office, together with Brophy College Prep, with St. Xavier Parish, all other Jesuit institutions in Arizona. But the reason that we were doing that rally on that particular day is because all of the Jesuit provincials on that day met with then Secretary of Homeland Security, Kevin McAleenan. And your provincial, you know what he spoke about? He spoke about Canisius making the decision this summer to welcome asylum seekers into your dorms. He spoke about that as an alternative to hospitality that shows that detention isn't always necessary. And so you were represented at that table, whether you know it or not, you were represented at that table with the provincial in front of then Secretary of Homeland Security, Kevin McAleenan, who incidentally the next day decided to resign. Kind of like I remember when Maynard resigned right after the Pope visited. It's kind of how it felt. But incidentally decided to resign. But the work that you do here on campus can be seen. And let's not let that be the only public instance of you as a campus deciding to manifest your hospitality. My invitation to you all is to think about how can we continue to engage in public prophetic action. Maybe that's action of very concrete hospitality. Maybe that's action of public demonstrations. Maybe that's action of prayer and accompaniment and pilgrimage. This is a picture of our Posada, which is my favorite day of the year. It's when we follow the journey of Mary and Joseph from downtown Nogales out to the Comelon and talk and sing about how there's no room at the inn as we stand now. There's many different ways to walk publicly. But my encouragement to all of you as you think about what would it look like for us to be more public? What would it look like for us to be more prophetic? Think about also how can we do that in a sustained way? It's very appropriate that this talk is on the day of the sesquicentennial, or during the year of the sesquicentennial, because Canisius has sustained a lot over 150 years, more than any of our lifetimes, I think. And so what would it look like to plant these seeds of hope in a way that's sustaining for the next 150 years? To be a campus that just as 150 years ago was designed in part to welcome immigrants and educate immigrants, how can we be a campus that continues to be designed for hospitality? It means sometimes being like this little candle. This is a candle that's painted onto the border wall. Sometimes it means finding those moments of flickering, but also thinking about how can we cultivate the flame of this candle. Sometimes we'll let it flicker, and sometimes we'll build it into a larger fire. And what it means is to not tire of preaching love. That though we see that waves of violence succeed in drowning out the fire of Christian love, love must win out. It is the only thing that can. So let's lean into that irrationality of hope. Let's not just lean into it, but let's act into it. Because even when the darkness seems overwhelming, we believe that love is the only thing that can win. And so it means taking actions in that faith. It means acting publicly and prophetically and sustainably with that faith. And wherever you are in this journey, there's ways that you can deepen your commitment. If you've never been to the detention center in Batavia, I'd encourage you to go and visit folks who are in detention there. There's a wealth of organizations here in Buffalo. They're doing incredible work of accompaniment. I've had the chance to meet some of them. I'm sure there's more that I'm not aware of. You can also, as I mentioned, public action in many times is in the terms of advocacy or defending. This is a critical time for your voice to be heard, because the Senate and the House of Representatives are voting on funding for Department of Homeland Security in the coming month. So they're deciding how much money should we send to detention centers, how much money should we send to Border Patrol agents, how much money should we allocate to alternatives to detention so folks don't have to be detained. You can weigh in on this. And I would encourage you to weigh in on this. You can also set up local meetings. There's parts of New York that guarantee universal representation. People who are in detention in New York have access to legal counsel, but not everybody who's released who lives in the community of Buffalo has access to legal counsel. Why can't Buffalo do that? Why can't you be part of that catalyst of change? And so my encouragement to you today would be to journey with us, to be part of that community that's welcomed and sustained Jose Luis and Cynthia, to be part of that community that can combat the despair of Roberto and Candelaria and Maria and Lydia, and to be that part of that community not just today, but in the days and weeks and months and years and maybe 150 years to come. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions if anyone would like to ask questions.
How did you start with the Kino Board Initiative? Like, how did you find out about it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I was a student at Georgetown University, and how many of you have participated in the teach-in? Raise your hand if you've gone to the Ignatian Family Teach-in for Justice. Raise your hand if you're going to the Ignatian Family Teach-in for Justice. Lovely. So Ignatian Family Teach-in for Justice was in DC. First year was in DC, was at Georgetown University. At that point, I'd already been volunteering in an immigrant community in Northern Virginia, and just had this discomfort in my soul where I said, I want to understand more about my neighbors. These neighbors that I've already been journeying with, they talk about the border, they talk about deportation. I've been with a kid whose dad was deported. What would it mean for me to understand this more? So I walked into the teaching with a little bit of this disquiet, and I went to a workout session that was about a breakout session about Kino Border Initiative. And I came back, and me and the other fellow students were comparing notes. Oh, how was your breakout? Oh, it was interesting. I learned X, Y, and Z. Hey, Joanna, how was your breakout? I said, I think I know where I'm going next fall. And so I called Father Sean, who's the director of Kino Border Initiative, within a few days, and I said, would you take me for a volunteer? I feel a sense of call. I think that this is the next step that God's calling me to. Would you be willing to take me as a volunteer? He fortunately said yes. Though, Spirit works in a lot of ways, so he could have said no. And when I was there in 2011, and it was the fall of 2011, I went to KBI, I really felt the rawness of being at the border. Some of what I've expressed in these slides. And there was something there that kept a piece of my soul and my heart there. So I went, I still graduated. I promised my parents I was going to graduate. That was the terms of our agreement for me to take a semester off and go to Kino Border Initiative. And then I journeyed in a couple of other capacities with migrants. But I always had a piece of my heart here. And so I was really glad to join that piece of my heart 4.5 years ago and start as full-time staff. And I think this is my story, but my encouragement to all of you would be to be open to hearing that voice that sounds a little irrational. It was an awkward conversation with my parents and with my friends to say, well, out of a single breakout session, I've decided the course of my life, or God has decided it for me, or whatever your interpretation of that is. But sometimes it's in that bit of irrationality how we can find our journey. And I'm really honored to be at KBI, and hopefully we'll be here for many years to come.
Thank you.
So what kind of policy then, like, since policy is like the major issue on this, and since it most likely has to be bipartisan, otherwise it will just piss off the other side, and no appeasement will be there properly to solve the problem. And the reason why so many people cross illegally, it seems like, is because the system is messed up. And even though President Trump is initiating the wall and everything, and it seems dehumanizing in a way, it kind of is, it doesn't promote like coming to the country, even though it secures the border more and it makes it a funnel in a way to bring people in. Shouldn't then a policy then be to better the system that comes in then? Or what would your opinion be on like making the policy better?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So I've offered a lot of hope and a lot of solutions, maybe intentionally. But for those of you who came yesterday to our Migration 101, you may have learned that it's been 54 years since we made any substantial change in how people enter this country. So definitely what you're pointing to, we need to update our immigration laws, make them more relevant for our 21st century reality, which means expanding ways of entry and the existing lines. So we have, for example, people who have immediate family members, siblings in the US, if they're from Mexico, they're waiting over 25 years to get into the US. That's not a functional legal immigration system. We need to update those ways of entry and make them more expedited, certainly than the backlogs we currently have. We also, as I've said, in the case of Cynthia, migration is not always the best option. And we need to create more policies in which migration doesn't have to be the number one option. So for example, we could work more on anti-corruption efforts. Right now we send a lot of military aid to Central America and to Mexico. And unfortunately that's, speaking of Oscar Romero, that was our policy also back in the 80s. But what we could do is invest in anti-corruption efforts. Like in Guatemala, there was a really successful commission against corruption that was able to indict many of the key leaders of these different corruption rings. And then the government shut it down because they didn't really like being put in jail. And the US didn't say anything. We didn't stop the Guatemalan government or discourage the Guatemalan government from shutting it down. So some of it is working on corruption in countries where folks are from, or providing other kinds of economic aid. And then I think the bishops and the Catholic Church is very clear about when we're arguing for humane and just policy, it doesn't mean that we're arguing for a policy that doesn't have any kind of enforcement or that doesn't recognize each country's sovereignty. But we're one of the few countries that invests a lot of resources in stopping people from getting in at the border. And then once somebody makes it to the US, can very easily get a job and work and make money and send money to their family. So we do need to look at different, more creative ways to make sure that the law functions and that it matters. And I would argue that that's not necessarily always going to be at the border. It could be more robust policies at the workplaces. Do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah.
You look like you have a follow-up question.
So in a way then, such as international organizations such as the UN, shouldn't then they be focused, instead of take the focus away from the US, for example, on the border, and put it in the UN, shouldn't then focus be on fixing the governments in such countries such as Mexico, where the police are so corrupt that they won't report such a little thing like that, or in El Salvador, or countries like those, the Latin American countries that are having such a problem and forcing their own people to come to a nation like the US, which has a big sovereignty stance in a way that will welcome people in, but the reason why we focus away and somewhat keeping people out in a way is that we have to first secure it and make sure that it works, and in a way that these countries can't work itself out, that there's just an overwhelming amount of people just coming to our country, that the reason why it seems dehumanizing that we try to push so many people out. The question is what should the UN do to fix this in a way? For even Mexico's government or South American government that needs to fix it.
Yeah, so it's you referenced the UN. I think the UN maybe is it's a body that's one manifestation of international cooperation. Ultimately, we need international cooperation around migration issues because this is an international reality. And another teaser, if you want to watch the Migration 101 video, we talked a lot about mobilities. So we're looking at people who are moving north, but there's also a lot of other things that are in movement, including guns from the US to Mexico, including demand for drugs in the US. So this is an issue that requires international cooperation. I don't know that the UN has the leadership or credibility to lead the charge on that. Just to be frank, and I say that with lots of love for my colleagues who work at the UN, it might not be the place that takes leadership. It might mean key countries, including the United States, but not limited to the United States, coming together at the table and saying, we're bought in, we want to work towards solutions, and we want to work in a collaborative way. Maybe we can get to that world. I think you're right to say that this isn't, A, it's not just an issue for the United States, but B, it's not just an issue in this corridor. It's not just an issue in the Western Hemisphere. This is a reality of movement that's global. And that's in one way, actually, why I would argue that we as Jesuit institutions are well positioned to address it. Because the Society of Jesus is global. And there's beautiful ways that we're collaborating on a civil society level and influencing governments in a multilateral way that respond to the complexity and international nature of migration.
Do you think then that something like a Marshall Plan for Central America would resolve some issues?
Well, I think that's become a little bit too much of a buzzword for me to use it. I think the Marshall Plan specifically came in a very particular historic moment. I think I understand, I don't want to critique those who propose a Marshall Plan for Central America. In some ways it comes out of a place of saying, we want a solution that we can move in, work for 2 years and leave, and there was more limited migration from Central America, the Marshall Plan was a pretty short term, it was a large investment, but it wasn't a long-term initiative. We're gonna need to be committed a lot more in the long term to these international discussions, to an evaluation of our own role, to collaboration with other governments and assistance. And so I think a Marshall Plan sometimes isn't the right framing to communicate to ourselves and to others the complexity of what it means to treat the root causes of migration.
I'm going to change topics 180 degrees.
No Marshall Plans.
You went to Georgetown.
I did.
What were the courses or what were the experiences that prepared you best for your current position?
So a few. One, I was a research assistant Georgetown was an Institute for the Study of International Migration. I knew I was going to get the acronym right. And there are several professors that do research in that area. So I was a research assistant for a professor that was an anthropologist by training, did a lot of ethnography. And that was actually another way in which I got out into the community and started interviewing people and started thinking about the complexity of the impact of policy. And then the course was I took a class by Susan Martin. Susan Martin, I would encourage you to look her up and read her books, especially if you're looking for solutions or how do we think about this holistically. Susan Martin was incidentally, again, preview to Migration 101. She was on the commission that made a lot of suggestions on how to improve migration in the 1990s that then Congress ignored. I took a class on refugees from her, and maybe I'm plagiarizing at this point, but I still quote her on a regular basis when I'm talking about asylum law or talking about refugee law. So in some ways it was being a research assistant, being out in the community, understanding research methods in a rigorous way, but also getting the chance to hear about experiences. And on the other hand, it was being in class and understanding policy and learning from a professor who thought about policy in a very complex way. That both of those have changed my way of being and thinking. I'm sure I'm not giving credit to many other professors, and I apologize to them. But those are the two that immediately jump to mind. So classes matter, writing matters a lot. I have to write lots of delicate things that I write to congressional representatives. So the fact that I learned how to write effectively and efficiently was the best. In the midst of all of that, was the best skill that I learned in college.
So I'm a journalism student. I'm about to take a class in Borders, Walls, and Immigration because I'm interested as a journalist how we can cover these things properly because obviously news has the opportunity to influence change. I'm kind of interested from your perspective, what could, our newspapers, our TV stations be doing better to more accurately represent this crisis at our border? Like, what do you think they're maybe missing in their coverage or could be better?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I appreciate you as a journalist wanting to understand about this. Lots of people are down on the media. I actually really appreciate the media and have great relationships with some in-depth reporters. I think that one of the biggest errors that media makes is that they want a narrative where someone's a hero and someone's a victim. And so if you read about how the media writes about migration, there's either a victim, there's either the Salvadoran dad that's washed up with a kid, or there's the dreamer that went to college and is and now is president of a Fortune 500 company. I don't know if that's actually true, but that kind of narrative. And I think media needs to be a lot more comfortable with the complexity of that. And you can write about people as protagonists without them being heroes or victims. So that would be one comment. And then the second is that I think that media, and I don't actually fault media just for this, I think we as organizations, as NGOs, haven't done a good job of this, of talking about why people stay. So if you listen to what I say or what other people say, we far too often give the impression that if the border were open, everybody from Central America and Mexico would run up to the US because we talk about the root causes, we talk about the violence, we talk about all these issues. And the reality is that there's a lot of people who are making the choice to stay, which is a complicated decision. It's not, it doesn't ignore the violence or the poverty. But I think if we were able to tell those stories more effectively, it would help us understand, the reality of people's situations, because the 95% of all of those countries have stayed put, and it's just a smaller percentage that have come. And B, it would give us more light into how do we move forward and what do solutions look like, what does community look like. And that's something I really credit our Jesuit partners in Central America for lifting up. Folks, I deeply admire folks at the UCA, or folks at Jesuit Migration Service in Nicaragua, who have chosen to stay, even though the oppressive current regime views them as political dissidents, and any day they could be arrested in their offices. So we need to be focusing on that story, and not just the story of the people who leave.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
And stay in touch when you write all your stories. I'll invite you down to the Comedor.
I just have another question. So just talking about the idea of misinformation and obviously not a lot of people not knowing too much about what's happening at the border or not knowing that much about immigration in general. What sources are media, paper sources, or anything really do you recommend for people to kind of learn more about it, or a safe, accurate source that's that really is able to emphasize and really talk about immigration as in general, especially down at the border?
Yeah. So one source that I subscribe to that I find the most helpful is the Latin America Working Group has a weekly digest of the news. And so they talk about U.S. enforcement, they talk about border, they talk about Mexico, they talk about El Salvador. They have a variety of articles in English and in Spanish. And that's my go-to. Every week I read through that, I choose the 5 articles I need to read, but even just looking at the headlines and the blurbs, I can get a sense of, what are people talking about, what are they thinking about? So that would be my number 1 recommendation, is to subscribe to the Latin America Working Group. I think in terms of news outlets, I'm sure lots of journalists are going to be offended when they watch this video. But I think The Guardian is one of the ones that has grappled with complexity and has a better formed immigration staff. I think in some ways, because it's not a US-based publication, it's thinking a little bigger picture. There's other US publications I could mention, but if I had to mention 2, I'd say subscribe to Latin America Working Group listserv and read articles about migration from The Guardian. And you can donate to them on their little, the Guardian doesn't have a paywall, so they always encourage you to donate. And I'll first of all donate to KPI, but then you can donate to The Guardian.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for your attention and welcome here. It's great to share with you, and please feel free to stay in touch and follow us. And I look forward to your future careers as journalists, activists, whatever you have in store.
And there are